Hey everybody, it is Tuesday, September 24th. You're listening to the Mo.news podcast. I'm mo.news.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. Jill, you made your way into the city yesterday. Just actually a few blocks from me. But I didn't get to see you. You were busy.
Yes, we're so close, but yet so far. I was very privileged to interview the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield. I met her at her residence, which has probably the best view of the UN and the East River that I've ever seen. And it, might I say, an amazing art collection as well. And she's just so nice. Lauren, one of our producers, came with me, and we just had a great conversation about not only her priorities this week as the UN General Assembly gets underway, but also just her approach to diplomacy, what she calls gumbo diplomacy, which you'll hear all about in the interview, which will be out in the next couple of days.
So the ambassador's residence, I imagine, is always whoever is ambassador gets to live there. So she currently resides there, but effectively it's a U.S. government apartment with the view of the UN.
Yes, and they get to choose their artwork, and it's just beautiful. And she's hosting a lot of diplomats, so I'm sure that view is quite impressive for them, as it was for me.
She's serving gumbo, it sounds like.
That's her go-to move.
Listen. My understanding when it comes to diplomacy is you gotta sometimes work through people's stomachs. And
it's true.
And so when you have a good meal, you might actually have a good conversation and might be able to resolve some things.
Works on me, Moshe. That's all I need.
Though I know you asked some challenging questions, Jill. We'll get to it in the podcast.
Yes, it was not just about gumbo, but we do have her gumbo recipe, which we'll be posting in the Mo News newsletter. So look out for that. All right, now to the headlines. Starting in the Middle East, Israel and Hezbollah ramp up attacks. But is it already the all-out regional war we've been dreading? Plus, I sat down with U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, as the UN General Assembly begins in Manhattan. Her priorities, as it feels like the world is on fire right now. President Biden addressing the UN later today. Hurricane Helene expected to slam into Florida this week, the projected path. What we're learning about a note that the gunman who tried to assassinate former President Trump on the golf course left behind. In California, Governor Newsom signs a law banning all plastic shopping bags at grocery stores. Why, he says the old law, which essentially did the same thing, didn't go far enough. And sticking with California, the state is suing ExxonMobil over deceptive plastic recycling claims. And Levi is teasing a collaboration with the Queen Bee, Beyoncé, as Denim makes a comeback. Don't call it a comeback, Moshe. I didn't realize Denim had ever left.
I am a jeans guy for life, Jill. I'm not, it's very rare that I'm wearing khakis or corduroys or anything else.
Now that you mention it, I don't think I've ever seen you in anything but jeans.
Yeah, no, I mean, when it gets hot enough in summer, I wear shorts, but anyway, denim for life.
And Moshe has on this day in history.
Jill, your clue today. Tick, 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 tick.
Is that a 60 Minutes?
Oh, she got it, everybody.
Oh, good.
Yeah, some 60 Minutes history on this day in history.
Okay, let's start in the Middle East, where the fighting between Israel and the Hezbollah terrorist group in Lebanon is escalating. While the two sides won't officially call it a war, by most definitions, it is a war.
Jill, as we've learned in the Middle East, they play by their own rules, and that includes how they define conflict.
Fighting has ramped up between Israel and Hezbollah over the past few days. Israel is bombing targets across many parts of Lebanon, striking senior Hezbollah terrorists in Beirut. Lebanon's health ministry says close to 500 people were killed and more than 1,600 wounded in Israeli strikes on Monday. That makes it the deadliest day of Israeli attacks there since at least 2006, when Israel and Hezbollah last fought a war against each other. Lebanon, by the way, does not distinguish between combatant and civilian deaths, although it said a couple dozen of the deaths are women and children. Israel is focused on Hezbollah strongholds, and the group has acknowledged that Israel has killed a number of its leaders. And it is certainly the most casualties in Lebanon since Hezbollah started to launch missile attacks against Israel in solidarity with Hamas after October 7th, which is how this latest round of violence between Israel and Hezbollah got started. At first, Israel would respond with just kind of like tit for tat missiles back, with a goal of returning about 100,000 Israelis who live near that border with Lebanon and have been displaced from their homes for months because of Hezbollah missiles. Israel's military spokesperson says its fighter jets struck just over 1,300 targets affiliated with the terror group, particularly in southern Lebanon. Hezbollah wasting no time in returning fire. Most Hezbollah missiles were intercepted by Israel's Iron Dome anti-missile defense system, but about 165 rockets crossed into Israeli territory, landing much deeper into Israel than in previous attacks. Moshe, Israel's hoping that ramping up attacks will get Hezbollah to back down. Last week, as we reported, blowing up Hezbollah pagers and communications devices. At this point, though, it is not looking like that's going to happen.
No, you have the Israelis who are trying to ramp up attacks and prove to Hezbollah that they need to end the missiles and rockets and bring northern Israel to peace. And then you have Hezbollah who says they're not going to back down when it comes to Israel. They are backed up by Iran here. They have 100,000 plus rockets, a pretty advanced military force that has been trained over the course of the decades. And they say they're not going to stop until Israel backs down in Gaza. So here we are. Hezbollah, by the way, stores thousands of those long-range rockets in civilian homes. This might sound familiar to you. The same thing Hamas does down in Gaza. And the Israelis have been warning Lebanese people via text message and automated calls to move away from areas they know where Hezbollah stores rockets. In some cases, if you live in Lebanon, you know if you live in a Hezbollah stronghold. In some cases, you may not know where Hezbollah stores all of its weaponry. So you do see sort of mass evacuations happening across Lebanon right now, particularly in that southern Lebanon area where Hezbollah operates pretty freely. And then there's certain neighborhoods in Beirut, when you see reports from explosions of Beirut, there are certain neighborhoods in Beirut that are pretty well known to be Hezbollah strongholds, including that neighborhood last week where the strike took out a number of top leaders of the Hezbollah group that we told you about on yesterday's podcast. Now, in Israel, there are precautions being taken as well. Schools remain closed in parts of northern Israel, including major cities, including the very populous city of Haifa. Israel has also restricted large gatherings. Only businesses close enough to shelters are allowed to open right now. And so you have this back and forth. Again, many people would look at it and say, this is definitely a war going on, but they're using their own terminology in the region right now, this back and forth, these ramped up attacks over the course of the past week. A reminder, Lebanon, the government there and most of the people there have no interest in a war right now. And so some of the intelligence is believed to be coming from and so some of the intelligence here is coming from Lebanese who bear no sympathy for Hezbollah, in fact, blame the group for ruining the country, partially ruining the country here. And so there's an understanding that there are some people in Lebanon who have an incentive to tell the Israelis about where Hezbollah is and provide them with intelligence. And this goes back decades, particularly the Christian community in Lebanon, the Druze community in Lebanon, other groups there that, again, have no love for Hezbollah and may be coordinating with the Israelis here. I've heard from Lebanese people for years, going back to the 2006 war. Can the Israelis just take care of the Hezbollah problem? Israelis would then reply to Lebanon, that's your problem that you've allowed to fester in the country for decades. And so, again, as we try to lay out what could happen here, it's important to understand the nuance that it's not just black and white, one side against another. There are a lot of associations, sympathies, histories, faiths, cultures, a whole variety of things that go deep here. And we will try to bring that to you. As the fighting continues here, we should note the Pentagon is sending dozens of more troops to the region right now. Their goal is to help protect the thousands of Americans who are stationed there. And we should note, historically speak, and we should note there was a major terrorist attack just 4 decades ago in Lebanon where U.S. Marines were based, a Hezbollah attack that killed several hundred U.S. Marines. So the U.S. role in the region also goes far back. And this is something you may have read in the Thomas Friedman book that came out decades ago called From Beirut to Jerusalem.
And Moshe, this all comes as world leaders meet at the UN this week for the UN General Assembly. By the numbers here, 133 heads of state or government, 3 vice presidents, 80 deputy prime ministers, and 45 ministers will converge on the east side of Manhattan. Among the issues expected to dominate, both in their public speeches and private meetings, the war in Gaza, as we are now nearing the 1-year anniversary of the attacks on October 7th, Ukraine, which is now well into 2 years into Russia's invasion, and also the crisis in Sudan.
So this is the UN annual gathering. It happens every September here in New York City. All the leaders that attend give some speeches. Not much gets accomplished in the main forum, in the main General Assembly. It's more talking at each other about their priorities. But a lot happens on the sidelines here in one-on-one meetings, in two-on-one meetings, small groups of various countries. Remember, the UN itself as a body is effectively split these days between democracies and authoritarian regimes. You talked about 193 countries there recognized by the UN, 80 or so democracies, 80 or so dictatorships or authoritarian regimes, and then a couple dozen countries that are in between, that are sort of in between nations. The big thing happening this week, world leaders are trying to get their meetings with Trump and Harris. Now, Biden does have his docket full, and he'll be meeting with a number of leaders. Already has, in fact, over the weekend. He was already with the Indian prime minister, the Japanese prime minister, the leader from Australia. So he'll have his meetings. This is Biden's last UN General Assembly as president. He gives a big speech today. He's likely to emphasize his work rebuilding alliances, leading the Western coalition in Ukraine. He may, touch on the efforts in the Middle East there, China policy. So he'll give his speech. And while Vice President Harris will not be attending that official speech, she is expected to have some sideline meetings right now, as is former President Trump. The only person who's lined up right now to meet with both Harris and Trump this week is Zelensky of Ukraine. You have a number of Middle Eastern leaders that'll also be having meetings this week with either of them or both of them. The Qatari Emir and Qatari Prime Minister will head down to Mar-a-Lago. You also have the leader of the United Arab Emirates meeting with Kamala Harris. Trump says he's going to meet with the Indian Prime Minister. That's an important relationship there. Modi and Trump were relatively close when he was president. So that's something to look out for, is the various headlines coming out of the one-on-one meetings there. Jill, you were across the street, as we mentioned earlier in the podcast, from the UN. You interviewed the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, yesterday about her priorities. How is she approaching all of this?
So, Moshe, I laid out a long list of the world conflicts, and I asked her which was her top priority.
She got her docket full, yeah.
All of the above. And I also asked her about those reports in the Wall Street Journal that we have reported here that some senior Biden officials now say that a ceasefire hostage deal likely will not happen by the time his term is over. She said, not surprisingly, they're still continuing to push and never say never, and they have to keep working on it. She actually said she is really dreading the October 7th anniversary just because she knows how painful it's going to be.
What I can say, and I heard this directly from the president, he has not given up. And he is continuing with the entire team to push for this ceasefire deal. And what that means for me is that I have to keep pushing for it. I have to keep engaging with my colleagues on the Security Council. I have to keep engaging with the Arab group, engaging with Israel and others to do the work that the president started for us, and that is push forward a ceasefire deal so that we can get hostages out, so that we can help Palestinians who are suffering mightily in Gaza. I am really dreading October 7th because it's going to bring back all of the horror and sadness that we felt when we woke up on the morning of October 8th and saw that Israel had suffered such a horrific attack. So that means we have to keep working on it. We can never give up. If you give up, you're not going to achieve. So those who are saying this is not going to be achieved before the end of the Biden administration, they can't predict the future. And they have to join the president and the entire national security team in working to make this happen.
She's taken a lot of incoming, Jill, because, the U.S. is a staunch supporter of Israel, and the UN is not a body that is very friendly to Israel, given the makeup of the world these days.
That's right. And she did want to call particular attention as well to the crisis in Sudan, which has forced more than 12 million Sudanese from their homes, facing a famine, what some say is a potential genocide. She's calling it the biggest humanitarian crisis on the globe and said it's basically about two men who want power. And then you've got all of these innocent people who are stuck in the middle. So she is making this huge push to call attention to that crisis, getting all the regional players together, trying to make sure that aid gets into the area. And it's a crisis that she says, which has gotten less attention in part because of everything else going on, notably the war in the Middle East and Ukraine.
Yeah, and there's less reporters there and less interest in it. And it's an internal conflict. As you mentioned, it's two men. It's the president of the country and the former vice president of the country, who each have their own militias and have gone to war with each other and led to millions of children going hungry. I mean, it is the worst humanitarian crisis on earth. We've talked about it here on this podcast and on the Instagram account as we try to bring attention to the issue. Jill, one thing as we prepared for this interview this week that we discussed was whether the UN is still relevant. It's a question we often ask here on the podcast and on our platforms, and something I know you wanted to bring up with her, because we talk about the G7, basically the largest 7 economies in the world and what gets done there. NATO, the largest military alliance in the world. The EU, BRICS, and how they've expanded, ASEAN, and the various economic groups around the world. And that appears to be where things get done. And then over in the UN, you got Russia, which invaded a sovereign country in Ukraine that sits on the Security Council and has its own veto power because of rules made back in 1945 at the end of World War II. So it basically has made the Security Council useless. China also has veto power at the Security Council. Then you have Iran, which has given senior roles on the Human Rights Council, despite gross violations of human rights in the country. The UN Women's Group took months to acknowledge that Hamas used sexual violence, even though that was very apparent on October 7th. And so the big question that I think we often ask here and our listeners ask is, what's the point of the UN? Can you actually get things done? I imagine you asked it in a much more polite, diplomatic way than I just phrased it, but what does she have to say about all that?
I basically asked it like that.
You're like Ambassador. What even gets done here?
There's a reason she's the diplomat and we're the journalists.
Right. We're the journalists. You're like, what's the point? What is the point of this body?
Okay, she actually said, though, it's a fair question, and that one of her big goals is to help reform the organization. Particularly, she wants to get more African representation on the Security Council. But that said, she did quote Madeleine Albright, who is one of her own role models, who said back in 2014 that if the UN didn't exist, we would invent it, underscoring the importance of diplomacy and trying to talk to get things done.
Yeah, we should note Albright was Bill Clinton's ambassador to the UN back in the 90s. She later served as Secretary of State. And that's what you hear from a lot of American officials, which is we need to at least, keep our seat at the table. And we're on the good team and we need to help reform things, even though it seems like very much an uphill slog. And then there are those who say this is a big waste of money. The U.S., puts a lot of money towards the UN budget, of course, plays host to it in New York City. And ultimately, while there's a lot of talking there, that things are actually getting done in non-UN bodies, in private meetings around the world, in one-on-ones, et cetera, especially in light of the fact that, Ukraine wars, we're approaching 3 years, Jill, in February. And of course, it doesn't appear there's any end in sight to Israel's war, to the Israel-Gaza war, as well as what's going on in Sudan and the other crises around the world. So we will continue to monitor the headlines on the UN in the coming days as the various world leaders address it, including, again, President Biden later today.
All right, time for the speed read from Fox Weather. Floridians are being warned that a major hurricane is headed their way later this week. A weather system in the Caribbean is expected to develop into Hurricane Helene, and rapidly intensify over the exceptionally warm Gulf of Mexico before slamming into the Gulf Coast later this week. The storm has not formed yet, but it is expected to soon. So the National Hurricane Center has dubbed it potential tropical cyclone 9 to warn of its imminent threat. Hurricane and tropical storm watches are in effect for parts of Mexico and Cuba. Similar alerts will be issued for the U.S. in coming days, with a potential landfall in Florida expected perhaps as soon as Thursday night. Florida not wasting any time getting preparations underway. Governor Ron DeSantis declared a state of emergency ahead of the storm for 41 of the state's 67 counties. The move helps to expedite preparations and coordination between the state and local governments.
So I've been watching the forecast throughout the day. On Monday, right now, it could be a Cat 2, it could even be a Cat 3, Jill. You mentioned the warm waters there that could increase the strengthening. We've seen a number of storms in recent hurricane seasons that have gone from Cat 1 to Cat 4 overnight. So they're watching this very closely. The cone right now, the cone of potential impact, effectively lies between Tampa and the Panhandle. And so it could fall anywhere near there. We still have a few days here. So the cone, ideally over time, will get smaller and give you a better sense of where it's headed. But given the size of this storm, a good portion of Florida could likely feel its effects. And we've talked about the storms that hit Florida before, that ultimately inland, they could have a number of effects, in places like Tallahassee, et cetera, tornadoes and various winds. And so you'll often see issues there as well. It is expected to drop potentially flooding rainfall over portions of Central America, Mexico, Cuba, Jamaica, as it tries to organize itself here. So again, it's still making its way. The track and strength could change here. But again, they're worried about really some strengthening here, given where we are at in the season, heading into October here. And so we will monitor this for all of you day by day. But a heads up, especially if you live on the west coast of Florida and the Panhandle area there.
From the Wall Street Journal, we're learning that the man who allegedly tried to kill Donald Trump on a Florida golf course had been planning for months to shoot the former president, keeping detailed lists of his whereabouts and writing a note in case the assassination attempt failed. The handwritten note from Ryan Wesley Routh said, quote, "Dear world, this was an assassination attempt on Donald Trump, but I am sorry I failed you. I tried my best and gave it all the gumption I could muster. It's up to you to finish the job, and I will offer $150,000 to whomever can complete the job." Federal prosecutors included a photo of the note in a new court filing Monday as they urged a judge to keep Routh detained while his court case proceeds. A witness found the note inside of a box that Routh had dropped off months before the September 15th golf course encounter. The witness opened the box, which also contained ammunition, tools, and a metal pipe, after learning that Routh had been accused of trying to kill Trump. Moshe, imagine finding that box by the golf course. Very scary.
Jill, we told folks last week that, he faced his initial gun charges, but as the investigation continued, Routh will likely be facing more counts here. And based on that note alone, effectively admitting what his plan was, prosecutors say they now plan to charge Routh with attempting to assassinate the former president. A judge ordered Routh to remain detained pending further proceedings here. So he's going to face multiple charges here, including the attempted assassination of a president. We heard some more details, too, in court yesterday. Trump apparently was 12 to 15 minutes away from arriving at the sixth hole of the golf course. That's where Routh actually had a clear shot about 100 feet away from Trump. Again, luckily, Secret Service was able to spot the gunman there behind the fence. Prosecutors saying this was an easy shot if somehow, God forbid, Trump had made it to the sixth hole here. The setup from his position included bags hung on the fence, armored plates inside that were able to withstand shots from the pistols of Secret Service. So effectively, he'd created a little bunker for himself. We told you in the last couple days that Routh had been there since 2 a.m. So he'd been there, set up there for 12 hours, and we're now learning that he had gone to the site several times in the weeks preceding there. Apparently, he kept very detailed handwritten lists of dates and places where he expected Trump to be present. This is something we've told you about before. The Secret Service has told Donald Trump, please be less predictable. It is very hard for us to defend golf courses here. And so that's what unfolded apparently last weekend. I'm sure, are going to continue to learn more here, given how open this guy was about his ambition here. Cell phone records also show that Routh had traveled multiple days near the golf club. He was really intent on scoping this out, getting a sense of the facility. And so they found that he spent pretty much the month in between mid-August there and the incident of September 15th, going there multiple times to stake out locations.
From the Associated Press, paper or plastic will no longer be a choice at grocery store checkout lines in California under a new law signed Sunday by Governor Gavin Newsom that bans all plastic shopping bags. California had already banned thin plastic shopping bags at supermarkets and other stores, but shoppers could purchase bags made with a thicker plastic that purportedly made them reusable and recyclable. The new measure, approved by state legislators last month, bans all plastic shopping bags starting in 2026. Consumers who don't bring their own bags will now simply be asked if they want a paper bag. One of the state senators who sponsored the bill said that people just weren't reusing or recycling plastic bags. She pointed to a study that found that the amount of plastic shopping bags trashed per person actually grew from 8 pounds per year in 2004 to 11 pounds per year in 2021. Hence, she said the previous bag ban passed a decade ago simply did not reduce the overall use of plastic. And if anything, Moshe, it sounds like it increased the amount of plastic.
Yeah, well, we all get those bags. Jill, in our closet, as we moved last month, we found the bag of bags. All those bags you get. And I'm like, I think we've collected like 100 bags. And you keep them. You're like, oh, I might need it, to carry stuff or, but ultimately you just collect them and you collect them and you collect them. And then what do you do when you have too many of them? You throw them away.
And by the way, when you need them, you could never find them.
You can never find them. It's like, where did we leave the bag of bags? Because
Yes.
I know I literally have 100 of them and I cannot find any of them right now. Joel, my favorite, the one that I reuse all the time, though, is the IKEA bag, that big blue bag. And basically, it's huge and just fits tons of stuff. So that bag I actually make use of, IKEA. Thank you. Anyway, California is one of 12 states that have instituted some type of plastic bag ban over the course of the past few years. There's also hundreds of cities across 28 states that have their own plastic bag bans in place. There are a number of countries, Jill, where it's actually, they warn you not to show up at the airport or be fined if you bring a plastic bag into the country. Rwanda, I think, is one of them. I remember when we traveled there for our honeymoon, they're like, just make sure there's no plastic bags in your suitcase. So some countries, on the whole, take this issue very seriously. We, like many things here in America, every state has its own rules. But it appears California is now going to be very restrictive about these, thicker plastic bags, reusable bags that people are not actually reusing, creating huge issues here, Jill. They create microplastics. Microplastics have been found at the top of the Himalayas, at the bottom of the ocean. They're everywhere at this point. So this is where we're at. So I think this is one of these things where we're going to look back 20 years from now being like, I can't believe the amount of plastic we were using.
And sticking with California, and for that matter, plastic, the LA Times reports that the California Attorney General filed a lawsuit against ExxonMobil on Monday. They allege the company carried out a decades-long campaign of deception in which it misled the public on the merits of plastic recycling. The complaint accuses Exxon of using slick marketing and misleading public statements for half a century to claim that recycling was an effective way to deal with plastic pollution. It alleges the company continues to perpetuate the myth of recycling even today. The case was filed in the San Francisco County Superior Court, and it seeks to compel ExxonMobil to end its, quote, deceptive practices that threaten the environment and the public. California is also asking that the court rule ExxonMobil to pay civil penalties, among other payments, for the harm inflicted by plastic pollution in California.
So these lawsuits against oil and gas companies for their role in climate change, in air pollution, are becoming more common. You've probably heard them multiple times here on the podcast. But yesterday's is the first in the country to take on a fossil fuel company for its messaging around plastic recycling. California says that ExxonMobil falsely, this is their quote here, falsely promoted all plastic as recyclable when in fact the vast majority of plastic products are not and likely cannot be recycled either technically or economically. Jill, if people are looking to get a deep dive into this, I often recommend the John Oliver takedown of plastic that he did on a show a couple of years ago. I think it's worth the 15 to 20 minutes to watch that. Keep in mind, some things have changed since then, but ultimately, he effectively describes the history here of how oil companies like ExxonMobil pushed the idea of plastic recycling, partially because ExxonMobil is the world's largest producer of polymers, materials made from fossil fuels that are used in single-use plastics, plastic utensils, drinking bottles, packaging. So ultimately, it was beneficial to these oil companies to push the idea of plastic because they helped make it. And the idea that the plastic is recyclable, made it palatable to people. I think that folks in recycling will tell you that if you look at every type of plastic you have, sometimes there's numbers on the plastic. And so certain numbers can be recycled, certain numbers can't be recycled. You have 1, 2, 3 through 9, I think typically. Again, the Oliver segment, and if you Google it online, you can learn more about it. Ultimately, the majority of us think the plastic can be recycled. It turns out that about 9% of the world's plastic can be recycled. In the US, it's about 5 or 6%. So 95% of the plastic we're using and potentially throwing in the recycling bin, not able to be recycled economically or at all. And so where does it end up? The landfill. What do? We pay countries to take our plastic. So there's certain countries around the world, typically poorer countries, that are paid by richer countries to take their plastic. And so the wildlife there, the people there, suffering from the consequences. This is just one aspect of the climate crisis. I know here in New York, as the UN is going on this week, you have a lot of climate officials discussing what can be done more on this issue and all related climate issues. Jill, I attended a breakfast yesterday with the heads of sustainability for T-Mobile, Amazon, and Alaska Airlines, talking about what those major companies are doing and the communication challenge around talking about it and the attention that they're getting or the lack of attention that they're getting. And so I know that there's a lot of major companies, some of the biggest ones in the world, that are all looking at their carbon footprint and what more they can do.
When I was talking to the UN ambassador earlier on Monday, she said that she had been meeting with a lot of young people, and the number one thing that they were concerned about, climate change. So certainly an issue that's top of mind this week.
Yeah, something I told the sustainability heads of these companies, I was like, listen, we hear from the mo.news community a lot, and they were very interested in what y'all have to say. And I said, we have two opposite ends of the spectrum. You have people who are worried about it and freaked out about it and think that the world is coming to an end. You have people who are in denial about it. And there's a big group in the middle that, wants to hear more, acknowledges the realities of it, but doesn't necessarily respond to the worst case scenario talk all the time. And so, a reality check on what could be, what might be, but also the solutions and, what's been prevented. There's actually progress being made. Is it enough? As of right now, no, but there is progress being made, and I think that's important to communicate to folks.
From CNBC, Levi Strauss summoned the Beehive on Monday after teasing a potential collaboration with Beyoncé in a post on Instagram. The post included an image of a woman wearing a cowboy hat and riding a horse with the caption, "Introducing a new chapter." Aside from the allusions to Beyoncé's latest album, Cowboy Carter, Levi's also tagged Beyoncé's account in the post, fueling buzz from her fan base, known as the Beehive.
So apparently this is pretty obvious because her country album, released earlier this year, features a song called Levi's Jeans.
My favorite song on the album.
There you go. So the collaboration here looks like it began with that song. Jill, looking at denim sales right now, they appear to be experiencing a bit of a boost of late. Brands like American Eagle, Abercrombie, calling out the trend to help revitalize sales. I didn't know you could call jeans a trend. I feel like, have they ever really gone away?
I guess that when athleisure became such a big trend during the pandemic, nobody wanted to wear anything except like stretch.
Jeans are comfortable, but there are things more comfortable than jeans. So that makes sense. You might say that just solely based on the amount of denim required for the Justin Timberlake, Britney Spears outfit at the MTV Awards 20 years ago, that could have been peak denim. But it appears denim is back. Again, for me, denim has never gone away.
That was either peak denim Or the death of denim.
The death of denim. Maybe that killed it for a while. We'll have to look at sales
like,
around
we're
that
done.
moment. We're done.
We need a break.
Like we can't, like you just, no, you can't be using that much denim. We must do other things. So apparently Levi's second quarter earnings missed Wall Street sales expectations, but the brand feels sales are bright. I feel like getting together with Beyoncé is probably a good start there. Jill, you have your local weekly newspaper, The Enclave, reporting on all things Long Island. I understand you guys have done some original reporting on this.
That's right. Beyoncé herself was spotted recording an ad for Levi's in Seacliff on Long Island. So this looks like it's not a rumor. This thing is happening.
Yeah.
And
no, if Enclave's reporting it, if Enclave's on it, you guys like take it to the bank.
If it's in Enclave, it's got to be true.
I think you need to trademark that phrase, right? I think you need to trademark that phrase right now. All right, now time for On This Day in History. We begin in 1789. On this day, Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1789. It was signed by President George Washington, establishing the Supreme Court. At that point, it was made up of 6 justices. He appointed them several days later. According to the Constitution, we should remind you, the size of the Supreme Court can be dictated by Congress. So we went through a number of phases there. It was 6, it was 8, it was 6. It now has been 9 now since about 1869. But the number can always change based on Congress, and there has been talk among Democrats, given the 6-3 conservative majority, about changing the makeup of the court. Remember, FDR tried that back in the 1930s. Didn't work out for him, and does not appear to be imminent at any point.
I think that having an even number of justices is difficult, though, because then how do you decide if there's a tie?
Jill, the 8-member court lasted a very short time. We were trying some stuff out in the 1800s.
Sense.
Around the time of the Civil War there, we had other issues going on, and they eventually took the court back to 9. All right. On this day in 1906, Devil's Tower in northeastern Wyoming was named the first national monument in the U.S. On this day in 1957, President Eisenhower ordered federal troops to escort 9 black students into an all-white high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. They would become known as the Little Rock 9 as part of desegregation there. And on this day in 1968, the answer to your clue, which Jill got at the top, tick, 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 tick. CBS aired the first episode of 60 Minutes, now the longest-running primetime show in American TV history. It was created by producer Don Hewitt. It featured reporters like Mike Wallace, who was a spokesperson for commercials at the time, but became a legit journalist there, an interviewer. 60 Minutes, one of the most successful programs in TV history. And Jill, I worked with them a number of times during my time at CBS. I got a lot of stories. Some I can share on this podcast. Some I cannot share on this podcast. Tune into Mo News Premium on Instagram for more details on my 60 Minutes experience.
Who are you, Maushamanunu?
Meaning I'm not willing to share?
No, like that's so like shade, like it's so cryptic.
Well, we're trying to tease more people to Mo News Premium. I gotta intrigue the news nerds to come on over there.
But you're not like a secret producer, like you've publicly produced these pieces.
Yeah, no, I work. Yeah, I was more talking about the inner office politics of 60 Minutes, not like I secretly no. But it's fascinating how that show operates, how old school it operates, the influence of that show. All fascinating details. You can learn more by joining Premium, mo.news/premium. If you're not already a member, what are you waiting for? We end here on this day in history with music and TV. As per usual, on this day in 1957, Elvis Presley releases his hit, Jailhouse Rock. On this day in 1993, Boy Meets World premieres. Jill is sort of an iconic show for millennials. Jill, was Boy Meets World still relevant to you, or were you a little too old for it?
Too old.
Too old. For those of us born in the slightly, for those of us born in like the, for those of us born, I think, 82 and after.
I'm a cusper. I'm a Gen X millennial cusper. So
yeah, you're like, Mosh. I was watching Beverly Hills 90210. I didn't have time for your Corey and Topanga nonsense on Boy Meets World. Big Bang Theory premiered on this day in 2007. It would become the biggest show in America, the biggest show around the world. So a happy 17th birthday to Big Bang Theory, which then, of course, gave birth to young Sheldon. So CBS really milked that for a good decade there.
as they should.
As you should in television.
Why not?
Jill, I don't know if people heard, they're bringing Matlock back.
Between Matlock, The West Wing, I mean, what's old is new again. Yeah,
they're bringing Matlock back with Kathy Bates. So look out for that. But yes, they've made some great shows, and I guess we have a loss for ideas. Everyone's still playing on nostalgia over and over again.
Well, when the Alf reboot comes back, this will be the first place you'll hear
I'm
about
producing it.
The only job you will take to leave Mo.news, Mosh, is an Alf reboot.
When I announced I'm leaving Mo.news, you're like, Mosh clearly got an offer to produce Alf. I have ideas. All right. This is going so off the rails. Thank you all for listening to the Mo.news. Jill wants to keep this podcast to half an hour. And I'm like, no, Jill, we have tangents. It's never going to hit 30. It's very rarely going to hit 30 minutes. We're either in a bad mood, sick, or doing a solo show. Because, okay, just let's end this.
we would miss a lot of the fun. I will say that.
Exactly.
All right. If you like what you hear, please share this with your friends. Will help us grow. Follow us and subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and review us in the App Store.
See you back here tomorrow, everybody.